Along about 1550 approximately, David might correct my dates on that. I just throw them out and y'all wrestle with the dates. The Catholic Counter-Reformation started. I believe it was called Counter-Reformation. That's right, Catholic Counter-Reformation. The Catholics had seen that there was a tremendous evangelism going on by those who had opposed them, namely the reformers by Lutheran and Calvin, Zwingli, and so many others, and that they were going into various countries and making converts when suddenly the Catholic Church began to say, what's going to happen to us if we don't start doing the same sort of thing? That is the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Two places they chose, first of all, countries in Africa, and specifically the country of India would be their targeted areas for evangelism. And they did a super job of evangelism, if you want to speak from their particular standpoint, and congratulate them for being so evangelistic. And then they came, of course, to the Americas and you know, all over the country. There's so many Catholic church buildings and cathedrals and so forth that came about as a result of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and their following the New World and the explorers into the New World. And so the Catholic Church began to grow everywhere and often exceeded the ability of the reformers to grow. And it was quite remarkable. It's interesting to look at what they did in the country of India, for example. People today ask us, well, how many people are responding to the faith? Is anyone responding? I've even been asked that question. Well, this year, 115,000 have been baptized since January 1. So people are still responding. The surprise is that back in 1550, they could also report 7,000 and 8,000 baptisms or converts. And that was the Catholic Church making its reports. So they have been exceedingly busy. The reason they chose countries in Africa and India in particular was because these places were dark. That is, they were besieged by the demons and by idolatry, and they needed the gospel. And they were easy targets as a result of that. We can go and we can teach them about the true and the living God. And they were correct. They could do that. And we have done the same sort of thing. I remember taking Ross Simpson, one of our deacons, to India with me on a mission. And one of the very first things that I did with Ross was to take him to a Hindu temple in the city of Bombay. It was a large temple and services were going on. We obtained permission, and you know Ross. He filmed, some of you at least would know him. He's one of our former deacons here. Lives up around Winchester somewhere now. But nonetheless, Ross was in there with his camera. He was filming, he was recording, and all of that sort of thing. And finally, we were able to go even into the back rooms where they kept the clothing of the idols. Now, it may surprise you when you read about clothing of gold and silver and idols of gold and silver in the Old Testament. Often those idols were made out of wood or stone or something else, and then they would fashion clothing out of pure gold and pure silver to place around the idols, and then the idols then would be carried and placed on a chariot, they call it. It's quite an elaborate kind of coach, usually pulled by as many as 8 or 10 bullocks, or bulls, you can say. And they would parade these down through the streets, and the God is sitting on a high throne inside that chariot, and all the people will see the God. Well, we were able to watch the priests as they were polishing the clothing and getting ready for a feast day and a time when they were taking the gods out into the city streets. We were allowed to pick up some of those clothing. And the shirt for one of those gods I picked up, and I was very surprised. I almost dropped it because it was so heavy. I believe it must have weighed somewhere between 30 and 35 pounds in that neighborhood. At least it felt that way to me. And Ross also gasped as he picked up one that was made out of gold that probably weighed 40 pounds. And it's tremendous what they do. On another occasion, we went to a Hindu temple, and I wanted to see the god, but the priest refused to allow me to see the god. I said, why? And he said, well, the god is resting. I said, you got to be kidding. He said, no, he takes a rest. This was like 11 o'clock in the morning. He takes a rest at midday. And I said, I've never seen a god at rest. Would it be possible? He said, yes, you can see him resting, but be quiet. We don't want to disturb the god. We went in there, and sure enough, they had placed black cloth, strips of black cloth over his eyes, sort of like wearing sleeping glasses or something, like on the airplane they'll give you to block out the sunlight. And so I was very quiet. I didn't trip over anything. I just tiptoed out of there because I sure didn't want to disturb him. Outside there was a fellow who had a booth over there, and he was selling images of the god, and he was also selling bells. Do you know that when you go into an idol's or a temple where an idol is, that there's a bell there right over the door, and you have to hit that bell as you go in? And I said, why do you do that? And they said, well, that's so you won't surprise the god, and that's to attract his attention to the fact that you're there, that you can talk with him and pray to him. So this fellow was selling his bells off to the side. I went out and I looked at his little gods, and I examined some of the bells, and I took a chance to ring one, because if you ring the bells, that gets the attention of the gods. So I rung the bell. I put it back down. I rung another bell. And the man said, these are on sale today. We've got a special on them today. And I said, I don't care what your special is. No need to tell me what you're going to sell it for. It doesn't work. What do you mean it doesn't work? He said. I said, I rung two of them, no god showed up. My brethren didn't know what to make of me. Went on down the way, another town, and another village. There was a Hindu priest there. He came to hear me preach. I preached several times, several days. He was at all the services, very interested in the gospel. At the last day, he said, brother, could you give me a Bible? He said, I would like to have a Bible. And I said, of course I can give you a Bible. And so I gave him about 5 of them, because I had an idea he could share them with some friends. And so I suggested that. He began a Bible class in his temple. And he started teaching the Bible every Sunday morning. He would have a Bible class. This went on for a full year. At the end of a year, I happened to be passing by that place. I stopped there. I did some preaching. He came to the meeting. And he said, brother, he said, I have taught this Bible for a full year now. I have studied it with other preachers of yours, and I have become convicted of the fact that my gods are no gods, and your God is the living God, and I want to be baptized. So we baptized him. Now, I knew right then that was a dangerous thing, even as you see in the book of Acts. When the Samaritans and some of the priests began to be converted, that's when the persecution started. It's okay for them just to read the book, just to teach the classes, but when it begins to sink into their hearts and they begin to convert, you got trouble. Satan doesn't like his workers being converted. It wasn't very long that word came to me that the priest's house had been burned. He managed to escape. And so another 6 months or a year went by, and I decided, okay, I'll go back through that way, but I'll be very careful about it, and I won't go around those folks. And so actually I didn't go into that town. I'm a coward at heart, you know. Or maybe I've got good sense. I know what those Hindus can do. I've seen their work. They don't mind torching a preacher. They have done that. The preacher by the name of Stang, with his two little children in their Jeep parked outside a church building on Orissa, learned that. And they burned them. They burned them. That was the news I woke up to one Sunday morning. Juanita was with me. We saw that headline. He had been a missionary there for 15 years from Australia. So I knew what they could do, what they were capable of doing. They're evil. And so I stayed outside of town, but word came to that priest that I was in the area, priest who is now a brother, whose house was burned. And he said, "Brother, you please come and visit my place and pray for me." How am I going to refuse that? So I said, "Okay, let's go." I went there with trepidation, knees knocking. I came there and I stood in the middle of his house. A big one-room kind of house, but fairly large, about 35 feet square. I stood in the middle of it, and suddenly I began to notice people were coming. Next thing I knew, we were totally surrounded. At that time, I said a silent prayer, asked the Lord to watch over my family, because I didn't expect to get out of there. I was one scared preacher. What am I supposed to do? Well, not just say a silent prayer. I thought it was time to pray. So I prayed. And I thought that would satisfy the need. And we prayed for the enemies of Christ who had done this thing to one of the Lord's servants. We prayed that the Lord would be patient with them, that they might hear the gospel. I didn't know they were going to hear it that day. But I got ready to leave after my prayer, and they said, "Brother, you haven't preached yet." And I said, "Oh, no." Now I will be in trouble. Because if I'm going to preach, I'm going to preach. And so I preached on idolatry, the same kind of passages you have in your hands right now. Those classic passages about the idols. They can't see, they can't feel, they don't have a heart, they don't have understanding, they can't speak. And so we prayed. I preached. And the crowd kept growing. I finished my sermon. They wanted more preaching. It was hot, brethren. I was standing in the open. Sweat was a-running. I preached again. I preached that day for some 3 hours. I was standing, they were standing, and they were crying, and they were repentant. A few of them were baptized that day. A few of them said, "We will rebuild our brother's house. We're sorry we burned it." Juanita has been with me on other occasions when we went and we saw where the priest had commanded that the brethren's homes be burned. We rebuilt those homes, you remember? But instead of making them out of straw and things that would burn, we made them out of brick and concrete. I guess you can destroy that with fire as well, but those houses are still standing, and the church is growing in those places. I'll tell you one or two more stories. I've got more. But I didn't come here just to tell you stories.